Hey guys, today we're going to talk about finding slope from an equation and y-intercept from an equation. So up here I put slope-intercept form, and if you remember, that is y equals mx plus b. Remember that m represents the slope, and I like to say that they used m because slope talks about how it moves. And then remember that B represents the y-intercept. And remember, the y-intercept is where your graph is going to cross that y-axis. So if we're going to look at it from an equation, you might have an equation that looks like y equals 3x plus 5. As long as it's in slope-intercept form, that slope and y-intercept should be easy to identify. Your slope is always going to be the coefficient to x. Remember, coefficient is the number attached to the variable. Your y-intercept is always going to be the number off to the back that's being added or subtracted. Now, one common mistake that people tend to make is they say that my slope is 3x. X is not part of your slope. It's just your coefficient. So in this equation, 3 is my slope and 5 is my y-intercept. So let's try another one. What about if we had something like y equals negative 2x minus 8? What do you think the slope and the y-intercept would be? All right, so my slope, my coefficient to x, is negative 2 because that's my whole coefficient to x. My y-intercept, or my b, is negative 8 or minus 8. So this tells me that my graph is moving down because it's a negative slope, a negative 2. Then there are some special cases that we talk about where it might not be quite as obvious what a slope or a y-intercept would be. So something like this. Let's go with, go ahead and take a second. What do you think the slope would be of that equation? So remember, slope is always the coefficient of x, and I know that in your guys' classes we've talked about if there's nothing written, it's understood to be a 1, or what a lot of your teachers refer to as a ghost 1. So in here, my slope is a negative 1. And then my y-intercept is 6. Okay, let's look at another example where it might not be as obvious. What about if I just had y equals 3x? You can pause this if you need to and see what you think the slope and y-intercept of y equals 3x would be. Okay, keep in mind that your slope is always your coefficient to your x. So if I'm looking at this, it doesn't look exactly the same as my slope-intercept form, but I do have an x, my y is by itself, and my coefficient to my x is a 3. Now if I'm looking for my y-intercept is what's being added or subtracted at the very end. If I'm looking at this, I don't have anything over here, which means my y-intercept is 0 because now my graph is going to cross my y-axis. Remember, your y-axis is the one that goes up and down. Okay, so it's going to cross this y-axis at 0. Good job. All right. Another example that might not be super obvious would be, what if it just said something like y equals 13? We still have to find a slope and we still have to find a y-intercept. Remember, B is our y-intercept, M is our slope. So if I'm looking at this, I know, again, my slope is my coefficient to x. I don't have an x anywhere here, which means I don't have a slope. My slope would be considered 0. My slope is 0 or no slope. My y-intercept is 13. So it would cross the y-axis up at the top of the graph between quadrant 1 and 2 at positive 13. And let's try what happens if, what if I have an equation that looks something like this? We can still find the slope and the y-intercept from that as is, or I know there are a lot of kids who feel more comfortable if they can rewrite it into a form that they're used to seeing. So my y is all by itself, and that's what it needs to be. So if we want it to match that, we can just bring our y over here. Because we're used to knowing what slope and y-intercept are, slope is coefficient x, I can take this right here, negative 2x or minus 2x, and put it out front. And then that means what I have left over, I'm just going to add to the back. So now this is the slope-intercept form we're used to seeing, but they mean the same thing. And I think we have covered most of them. So finding slope from an equation is the easiest form because all you have to do is look at your given information, and slope is the coefficient of x. Y-intercept is what's being added or subtracted to the very end. So I hope this helped you, and if you have any questions, there's another video that's going to be linked. I hope you guys are having a great time, and we will see you later.